Richard sat in his office late one evening. The precinct quiet except for the occasional shuffle of a night shift officer. The hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint sound of distant chatter provided a steady rhythm to his thoughts. On his desk was a folder labeled Progress Report, containing metrics on complaints, community relations, and officer evaluations. The numbers told a promising story. Misconduct reports were down, community satisfaction was up, and internal surveys showed a growing sense of morale among the team. But the numbers, while encouraging, only told part of the story. The real change, Richard knew, was harder to measure. It was in the way officers now carried themselves with a sense of pride, in the conversations that felt more inclusive and respectful, and in the tentative smiles from community members who had once regarded the precinct with suspicion. Change had come, not as a tidal wave, but as a steady tide washing away the debris of the past. The lessons of the past months weighed heavily on Richard, their impact etched into his resolve. Leadership, he realized, was less about issuing orders and more about modeling the values you wanted others to embody. His decision to walk the halls daily, to engage with his officers face to face, had done more to shape the culture than any memo or mandate ever could. He thought about Officer Reyes, who had transformed from a quiet bystander into a leader who now inspired her peers. She was proof that change wasn't just possible, it was contagious. Her courage to speak up had rippled outward, encouraging others to reflect on their own actions. Richard smiled at the memory of her thanking him for pushing her to be better. In truth, she had done the hard work herself. He had simply given her permission to try. There were lessons in the resistance as well. Officers like Daniels, who had clung to the old ways, had taught Richard that not everyone could, or would, change. Leadership meant knowing when to let go, even if it meant facing backlash. Daniels's dismissal had sent shockwaves through the department, but it had also drawn a clear line. The values of the past would no longer dictate the future. For every Daniels who had refused to grow, there were officers who had risen to the challenge, proving that accountability wasn't just a punishment, it was an opportunity. Outside the precinct, the community had its own lessons to offer. Richard remembered the young boy at the outreach event who had asked if the police cared. The boy's words had haunted him, a reminder of how deeply trust had been broken. But it had also strengthened his resolve to rebuild that trust, one interaction at a time. The precinct had started hosting regular town halls, not just to listen, but to show the community that their voices mattered. Slowly, the walls of mistrust began to crumble. One moment stood out above the rest. A middle-aged woman approached Richard after a town hall meeting, her eyes brimming with tears. "I was wrong about you," she admitted. "About this department. I see now that you're trying, and I see the difference." Richard had thanked her, his voice thick with emotion. It wasn't validation he sought, but acknowledgement that the work they were doing mattered. The most important lesson, though, was one Richard had known all along. Change wasn't about perfection, it was about persistence. The precinct wasn't perfect, far from it. There were still moments of tension, mistakes made, and work to be done, but the direction was clear, and the foundation was stronger than ever. As he prepared to leave for the night, Richard paused in the hallway, watching the precinct settle into its rhythm. Officers greeted each other with nods of respect, the banter light but inclusive. He heard Reyes laughing with a group near the break room, her voice carrying a confidence that had once been absent. Even the quiet moments felt different, charged with a sense of purpose rather than complacency. Richard exhaled, a rare smile breaking across his face. The journey had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated, but it had also reaffirmed his belief in the power of leadership and integrity. Change, he realized, wasn't about one person or one moment. It was about the collective choices of a group committed to being better. Before heading out, he wrote a note on a fresh piece of paper and tacked it to the bulletin board in the main hallway. It was simple, but it captured everything he wanted his officers to remember. Respect is not given, it's earned. Integrity is not claimed, it's proven. Trust is not built overnight, it's built every day. Let's keep going. As he stepped into the cool night air, Richard felt lighter than he had in months. The road ahead was still long, but the path was clear. Together, they were building something better, something lasting, and that, he knew, was worth every fight. The sun hung low over Blue Ridge, North Carolina, casting a humid haze over the town as morning crept in. The air was thick and stifling, clinging to every surface like an unwelcome guest. Richard Nelson stepped out of his car, the gravel crunching under his scuffed sneakers, dressed in a simple plaid shirt and worn jeans. He looked more like a man headed to a hardware store than the newly appointed chief of police. That was exactly the image he intended to project. Adjusting the brim of his faded baseball cap, Richard took a steadying breath. This was not just a job for him. It was a mission. Blue Ridge's precinct, nestled in the heart of the small city, had long been whispered about. Allegations of misconduct, tales of unchecked egos, and rumors of a toxic culture swirled like a storm cloud around its reputation. As a black man stepping into a role that many had privately doubted he could handle, Richard knew the stakes were high. He wasn't here to play it safe or to be a figurehead. He was here to confront the festering issues head-on. But first, he needed to see the department for what it truly was, not through the polished lens of official meetings or carefully orchestrated introductions. The precinct parking lot buzzed with the usual morning activity. Officers milled about, some swapping casual banter while others clutched coffee cups like lifelines. Richard stood unnoticed among them, scanning the scene with a practiced eye. The cliques were easy to spot, veterans with their arms crossed in silent judgment, younger recruits hanging on their every word. No one gave him a second glance, and he preferred it that way. He walked toward the building, the heat pressing against his back. The precinct itself was unremarkable. A brick structure with peeling paint and tired windows that seemed to sag under the weight of decades of use. The faint hum of ringing phones and muffled voices spilled out as Richard stepped through a side entrance, the cool air inside offering brief relief. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a harsh glow on the tiled floors, which shone with an almost unnatural cleanliness. The smell of stale coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the faint tang of cleaning supplies. Richard moved slowly, his steps deliberate. As he took in the dynamics around him, groups of officers clustered near desks, some flipping through paperwork, others cracking jokes. There was a casual energy to the room, but it was undercut by something heavier, an undercurrent of complacency, perhaps even arrogance. This wasn't just a team, it was a hierarchy, one built on unspoken rules and unchecked power. For a moment, Richard allowed himself to feel the weight of what lay ahead. This precinct didn't just need reform, it needed a reckoning. He had faced resistance before, but this was different. These walls held years of entrenched behaviors, the kind that didn't crumble easily. Yet, as he adjusted the brim of his cap and straightened his posture, Richard knew one thing for certain. He hadn't come to Blue Ridge to be liked. He had come to make a difference. The first thing Richard noticed as he moved deeper into the precinct was the noise. Not the productive hum of a workplace, but the kind of idle chatter that carried a sharp edge. He paused near the break room, the smell of burnt coffee wafting toward him as laughter echoed from inside. Peeking through the doorway, he saw a group of officers huddled around a small table. One of them, a burly man with a cocky grin, was mid-story, his arms gesturing wildly while the others leaned in, hanging on his every word. Richard didn't need to hear the punchline to know it wasn't in good taste. The laughter was too loud, too pointed, and he noticed a younger officer sitting stiffly at the edge of the group, her smile strained. This was what he had come to see. The dynamics beneath the surface. On the surface, the precinct looked functional, but moments like this revealed its undercurrents. Richard moved on, keeping his pace steady and his expression neutral. He wanted to observe, not interrupt, at least not yet. As he walked, he noticed how the officers interacted. Veterans barked orders at recruits with little regard for politeness, their tone carrying more dominance than mentorship. A few officers exchanged knowing glances, their smirks suggesting a shared joke at someone else's expense. The environment was clear. Respect was earned here, not granted, and the cost of earning it seemed steep. He reached the central desk area, where a phone rang incessantly, ignored by the two officers seated nearby. One, a middle-aged man with a graying beard, scrolled through his phone, barely looking up. The other, a younger man, scribbled half-heartedly in a notebook, glancing occasionally at the door as if counting the hours until his shift ended. Richard leaned against the counter, watching. No one asked who he was or why he was there. He wasn't invisible. They simply didn't care. "Hey, you!" A sharp voice cut through the noise, drawing his attention. Richard turned to see a tall officer with a nameplate that read Daniels, striding toward him. Daniels wore a badge of arrogance as clearly as the one pinned to his chest. He stopped a few feet away, his hands on his hips, his smirk faintly visible beneath his aviator sunglasses. "You lost, old man?" Daniels asked, his voice dripping with mockery. "This isn't a shelter." Richard didn't respond immediately, letting the words hang in the air. He met Daniels's gaze, his face unreadable. The officer's smirk widened, mistaking Richard's silence for submission. "I said," Daniels continued, stepping closer, "you need to take that mess somewhere else. We've got enough riffraff to deal with around here without you adding to it." From the corner of his eye, Richard noticed other officers stopping to watch. Their curiosity piqued. Some leaned against desks, their expressions expectant, as if waiting for the punchline of a joke. Daniels leaned in, his voice rising. "Didn't you hear me, buddy? Get out of here." The room fell silent as Daniels stepped even closer, his smug grin giving way to something sharper. And then it happened. Daniels spat. The action as quick as it was shocking. Warm saliva hit Richard's cheek, sliding down as time seemed to freeze. A ripple of laughter erupted behind Daniels, and Richard heard one officer mutter something about showing the nobodies their place. Richard's jaw tightened, his chest tightening with the urge to respond. But he didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, wiping his face with slow, deliberate movements. The room watched, their laughter fading into an uneasy silence as Richard straightened his posture, his eyes locking on Daniels. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" Richard asked, his voice calm but cutting. Daniels shrugged, his grin faltering. "Only the ones who don't belong." Richard held his gaze for a long moment, then turned and walked away without another word. Behind him, the room buzzed with whispers, but he ignored them. His heart pounded, not with anger, but with determination. He'd seen enough. As he walked toward the main office, the intercom crackled to life, summoning all personnel to the briefing room. Richard smiled to himself, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders. It was time to introduce himself, and to show them exactly who they were dealing with. The briefing room was abuzz with chatter as officers filtered in, their voices bouncing off the sterile walls. The room smelled faintly of coffee and dust, a mix of early mornings and long days. Officers leaned against walls or sat in worn chairs, clutching notepads or styrofoam cups. The energy was casual, almost lazy, as though no one expected much from this meeting. Richard stood just outside the door, his hand resting lightly on the folder bearing the precinct's official seal. His face was calm, but inside, he felt the slow burn of resolve building. "Settle down, everyone," barked Captain Harris, a stout man with a graying mustache and a voice that carried authority. The room gradually quieted, though a few murmurs persisted. In the corner, Daniels stood with his arms crossed, his face still smug from the earlier encounter. He leaned casually against the wall, clearly unaware of the storm about to hit. "As most of you know," Harris began, "Chief Caldwell retired last month. We've been waiting for his replacement, and today's the day we meet him." He paused for effect, glancing toward the door where Richard stood just out of sight. "I'm pleased to introduce our new chief of police." Richard stepped into the room, his footsteps deliberate and measured. The air seemed to shift as heads turned, and the room fell silent. The officers' expressions ranged from curious to stunned, their casual postures stiffening as they realized who he was. Richard walked to the podium, his presence commanding attention. Daniels's smirk faltered, and the color drained from his face as recognition dawned. Richard placed the folder on the lectern, scanning the room with a steady gaze. His silence stretched long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Good morning, "My name is Richard Nelson," he began, his tone measured. "As of today, I am your new chief of police." The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy fog. Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his bravado from earlier evaporating under Richard's unflinching gaze. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier banter now a distant memory. "When I arrived this morning," Richard continued, "I chose to come in plain clothes. I wanted to see this department as it truly is, without the filter of titles or formalities." He paused, letting the tension build. What I witnessed was eye-opening. A murmur rippled through the room, but Richard raised a hand, silencing it instantly. His eyes locked on Daniels for a brief moment before sweeping across the rest of the group. "In my brief time here," he said, his voice sharpening, "I've already seen behaviors that are not just unprofessional, but outright unacceptable. Let me make one thing perfectly clear. The culture that has been allowed to thrive in this department ends today." The room remained eerily quiet. Daniels's face turned a deep shade of red, his eyes darting to the floor. Richard took a step closer to the edge of the podium, his tone laced with quiet authority. "Respect," he said, "is not optional. It is the foundation of everything we do as law enforcement. Without it, we fail, not just each other, but the community we serve." This morning, some of you laughed at what you thought was just another powerless man being put in his place. His words cut through the air like a blade. "But let me remind you, everyone who walks through these doors deserves respect, whether they wear a badge or not." The officers shifted in their seats, the silence stretching unbearably. Richard let the moment linger, his gaze unwavering. Then, he turned his attention directly to Daniels. "Officer Daniels," he said, his voice steady but sharp. Daniels flinched, his confidence now a distant memory. "You represent everything that is broken in this department. When you spat in my face this morning, it wasn't just me you disrespected. It was the badge, the oath, and the community we swore to protect." Daniels stammered. "Chief, I didn't know." "That's the problem," Richard interrupted, his voice rising. "You didn't care to know. You acted without thinking because you assumed the man standing in front of you didn't matter. That assumption is exactly why this department has lost the trust of the people it serves." The room was silent, every officer frozen in place. Richard straightened, his voice steady but resolute. "This isn't just about one man's mistake. It's about a culture where bullying and prejudice are tolerated and celebrated. That stops now, effective immediately. Officer Daniels is suspended pending an internal investigation." Gasps rippled through the room. Daniels's face turned crimson, his jaw tightening as he avoided the stares of his peers. Richard's gaze swept the room one last time. "This is the first of many changes," he said firmly. "If you're ready to rise to the standard I expect, we'll move forward together. But if you're not, this isn't the place for you." With that, Richard stepped back from the podium. The officers sat in stunned silence as the meeting concluded, their usual chatter replaced by the heavy weight of accountability. Richard had made his first move, and the battle for the precinct's soul had begun. The precinct was quieter than usual that afternoon. Word had spread quickly about the morning's briefing, and the officers moved through the building with an air of unease. Conversations were hushed, sidelong glances were exchanged, and the usual camaraderie felt strained. Richard, now in his office, sifted through personnel files. The folder before him contained Daniels's disciplinary record, a damning collection of complaints ranging from excessive force to inappropriate conduct. It wasn't just about Daniels, though. This was a window into the systemic rot he had vowed to root out. Richard leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. His mind replayed the moment at the podium. He hadn't planned to suspend Daniels so publicly, but the man's blatant disrespect demanded an immediate response. For change to begin, the line had to be drawn boldly and unmistakably. He knew the decision would polarize the department, but he hadn't come to Blue Ridge to avoid difficult choices. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. "Come in," he called, his voice steady. Captain Harris stepped inside, his expression a mix of tension and approval. "Chief," Harris began, his voice low, "you certainly made an impression this morning." Richard gestured for him to sit. And what's the fallout? Harris sighed, leaning forward in his chair. The rank and file are rattled. Some are angry. Others are reflective. It's a mixed bag. But one thing's certain, they're paying attention. Richard nodded, his expression thoughtful. Good. Attention is the first step. What about Daniels? Harris hesitated. He's angry. Of course. Claimed he didn't know who you were. Which, frankly, doesn't matter. His suspension has sent a strong message. But I'd be lying if I said everyone sees it that way. Some think it was harsh. Others think it's overdue. Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. Captain, I didn't come here to play politics or win a popularity contest. This department needs a reset. Daniels is an example of what we cannot tolerate. If that means making waves, so be it. Harris nodded slowly. Understood, Chief. But you should know, there are a few others who share Daniels's mindset. They won't go down without a fight. Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. Then they'll learn, or they'll leave. Harris stood, tipping his head in respect. I'll get that full report on Daniels to you by the end of the day. As the door closed behind Harris, Richard stood and moved to the window. Outside, officers crossed the parking lot, their movements purposeful but subdued. He wondered how many of them were rethinking their behavior, how many were grappling with what the morning's events meant for them personally. Later that afternoon, Richard took a deliberate walk through the precinct. It was a calculated move, not to intimidate, but to remind the officers that he was present and watching. Conversations quieted as he passed. Some officers offered hesitant nods. Others avoided his gaze entirely. Richard greeted each one, his tone calm but firm, a quiet authority in every word. He stopped at the break room, where earlier that day he had faced Daniels's scorn. A younger officer, Reyes, sat alone at the table, her eyes darting up nervously as he entered. Officer Reyes, Richard said, his voice even. May I sit? Reyes nodded quickly. Of course, Chief. Richard settled into the chair across from her. I noticed you this morning, he began. You were quiet during the incident. Reyes swallowed hard, her fingers fidgeting with a coffee cup. I didn't know what to do, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I mean, Daniels, he's intimidating. Richard nodded, letting the silence stretch for a moment. Fear is a powerful thing, he said finally. It can keep us silent when we know we should speak. But change starts when we decide not to let fear control us. Reyes looked up, her eyes meeting his. There was hesitation there, but also a flicker of something else, determination. I want to do better. Chief, she said earnestly, I want to help fix this. That's all I ask. Richard replied, his tone kind but firm. It starts with you, one choice at a time. Reyes nodded, her shoulders straightening slightly. Richard stood, offering her a brief but encouraging smile before continuing his walk. He knew not every officer would be as receptive, but small steps mattered. It was progress. By the end of the day, Richard returned to his office, a faint sense of satisfaction settling over him. The precinct was far from transformed, but the first cracks in its toxic foundation had appeared. He knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with resistance, but he also knew that the seeds of change had been planted. Now, it was up to him to nurture them, no matter how challenging the task. The next morning, a tense energy lingered in the precinct like a storm cloud refusing to break. The usual morning bustle was subdued, replaced by quiet conversations in corners and the occasional glance toward Richard's office. The officers were still grappling with the events of the previous day, and Richard knew the confrontation with Daniels had drawn a line in the sand. Not everyone would be willing to cross it. Richard arrived early, reviewing the reports Captain Harris had delivered overnight. Daniels's file was thick with red flags, excessive force complaints, insubordination, and a pattern of behavior that spoke to a deeper cultural problem. But what struck Richard most was the silence surrounding those complaints. None had resulted in disciplinary action. It was a damning indictment of the department's leadership before him. He was halfway through the file when Harris entered, a grim look on his face. Chief, he began, his tone cautious. "We've got a situation." Richard set the file aside and gestured for Harris to continue. "Daniels," Harris said with a sigh. "He's not taking this quietly. Word is, he's been stirring the pot with some of the officers, talking about how you're an outsider, that you don't understand how things work here." Richard's expression didn't waver, though the words struck a nerve. He had expected resistance, but hearing it articulated so plainly was a reminder of the uphill battle he faced. "And?" he asked evenly. Harris hesitated. "And some of them are listening. A few senior officers have started voicing concerns, nothing outright insubordinate, but enough to make waves." Richard leaned back in his chair, his hands steepled in front of him. "Let them talk," he said after a moment. "Resistance is part of change. What matters is how we respond to it." Harris nodded, though his expression remained wary. "Understood, Chief, but I thought you should know." After Harris left, Richard stood and looked out his office window. Below, officers moved through the precinct with guarded expressions, their usual camaraderie fractured. He could sense the fault lines forming, but he also knew that this was the natural order of transformation. The old ways didn't die quietly. Later that morning, Richard held a meeting with the department's leadership team. The room was filled with captains and lieutenants, most of whom wore expressions ranging from curiosity to outright skepticism. Richard addressed them with the same calm authority he had shown the day before. "I understand that some of you are uneasy about the changes I've implemented," he began, his voice steady. "I didn't come here to disrupt for the sake of disruption, but let me be clear. The culture that has been allowed to thrive in this department is unacceptable. We cannot serve the community if we do not hold ourselves to the highest standards of respect and accountability." A captain at the far end of the table shifted uncomfortably. "Chief," he said cautiously, "with all due respect, some of us feel like this is happening too fast. The officers need time to adjust." Richard's gaze sharpened. "Captain, the people we serve don't have the luxury of waiting for us to get our act together. Every day we delay, we fail them, and we fail ourselves." The room fell silent, the weight of Richard's words sinking in. He didn't expect unanimous support, but he wanted them to understand the stakes. After the meeting, a few officers lingered, offering hesitant words of encouragement. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That afternoon, Richard made another deliberate walk through the precinct. The tension was palpable, but he refused to retreat. He greeted each officer he passed, his presence a quiet reminder of his leadership. Near the locker rooms, he encountered Daniels, who was standing with a small group of officers. The conversation stopped abruptly as Richard approached. "Officer Daniels," Richard said, his tone neutral but firm. "A word?" Daniels stiffened, his bravado from the previous day replaced by a wary defensiveness. The other officers quickly dispersed, leaving the two men alone in the hallway. "I understand you've been vocal about your disagreement with my leadership," Richard said, his gaze unwavering. Daniels crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. "I'm just saying what a lot of us are thinking. Chief, you don't know how things work here." Richard stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "You're right. I don't know everything about this department, but I know enough to see what's broken, and I'm here to fix it. You can either be part of that process or step aside. The choice is yours." Daniels didn't respond, his eyes darting to the floor. After a long moment, Richard walked away, leaving the officer to wrestle with his words. By the end of the day, the precinct felt different. The resistance was still there, but so was the beginning of something new. A younger officer, Reyes, stopped Richard in the hallway as he headed to his office. "Chief," she said hesitantly, "I just wanted to say thank you for standing up for what's right." Richard smiled, a rare but genuine expression. "It's not easy, Officer Reyes, but it's worth it." As he sat at his desk that evening, Richard allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The road ahead was still steep, but the cracks in the old culture were starting to show. It wasn't enough yet, but it was a start, and for now, that was all he needed. The following week, the precinct remained under a cloud of tension, but Richard could see subtle shifts beginning to take root. Some officers were quieter, more introspective. their usual banter replaced with cautious observation. Others, like Officer Daniels, clung to their defiance, rallying pockets of resistance among their peers. Richard, however, remained undeterred. He knew change wasn't about grand gestures. It was about persistence and a willingness to face discomfort head-on. On Monday morning, Richard called a mandatory meeting in the precinct's conference room. The officers filed in slowly, their expressions ranging from skeptical to outright annoyed. Richard stood at the front, his posture relaxed but his gaze sharp. The folder containing Danielle's disciplinary file placed deliberately on the table beside him. "Good morning," Richard began, his voice steady but commanding. "Today, we're going to have an honest conversation about what this department represents, not just to ourselves, but to the community we serve." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. For too long, this precinct has operated under a culture that prioritizes ego over service, dominance over respect. That ends now. His tone was firm, but not angry. This isn't about punishment. It's about accountability. And it's about making this department a place where integrity is not negotiable. He glanced around the room, his gaze lingering on some of the senior officers. "I won't pretend this is going to be easy. Change never is. But let me remind you, the badge we wear is not a shield for misconduct. It is a symbol of trust. And every time one of us abuses that trust, we damage not just ourselves but the entire community." An officer near the back, a gruff man with years of service etched into his face, raised his hand. "Chief," he said, his tone cautious, "a lot of us feel like you're painting us all with the same brush. Not all of us are the problem." Richard nodded, acknowledging the sentiment. "You're right. Not everyone in this room has crossed the line. But tell me this. How many of you have witnessed behavior you knew was wrong but stayed silent?" A heavy silence fell over the room. A few officers exchanged uneasy glances, and the older officer who had spoken shifted in his seat. "That silence," Richard continued, his voice soft but resolute, "is part of the problem. Change starts with each of us being willing to confront what's wrong, even when it's uncomfortable." The meeting ended with a palpable sense of unease, but also a flicker of hope. Richard knew he hadn't won everyone over, but he had planted seeds of doubt in the minds of those who still resisted. That was enough for now. Later that afternoon, Richard walked the halls, his presence becoming a familiar sight. He stopped by the desk of Officer Reyes, who looked up with a nervous smile. "Chief," she said, her voice hesitant. "Officer Reyes," Richard replied, leaning against the edge of her desk. "How are you holding up?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I'm okay. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about silence." Richard gave her a small smile. "Thinking is the first step. Action is the next." Reyes straightened in her chair, her expression growing more serious. "I want to do better, Chief, but I'm not sure where to start." "Start by leading by example," Richard said simply. "Speak up when you see something wrong. Treat everyone, your colleagues, civilians, anyone, with the respect they deserve. It's not about grand gestures. It's about consistent choices." Reyes nodded, determination flickering in her eyes. "I can do that." Not everyone was as receptive. Daniels, emboldened by a small group of loyalists, continued to undermine Richard's leadership, spreading rumors and questioning his authority. Richard received reports of whispered conversations in the locker rooms and subtle acts of defiance. One afternoon, he found a stack of paperwork on his desk stamped with a juvenile note. "Respect is earned, not forced." Richard smirked faintly as he crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash. Resistance was expected. What mattered was that it wasn't unchecked. The tide began to turn when the department held a community outreach event that weekend. Richard made a point of attending, shaking hands with residents and listening to their concerns. The event drew a mix of skepticism and cautious optimism from the community. But one moment stood out. A young boy, no older than 10, approached Richard with wide eyes. "Are you really the chief?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am," Richard said, crouching down to meet the boy's gaze. My dad says the police don't care about people like us. The boy continued, his words a knife in Richard's chest. Richard took a deep breath. I'm sorry your dad feels that way, but I promise you, we're working to change that. The boy studied him for a long moment before nodding. Okay. It was a small interaction, but it stayed with Richard long after the event ended. Change wouldn't come from winning over the loudest critics. It would come from rebuilding trust, one person at a time. By the end of the week, the precinct felt subtly different. Officers like Reyes began to step up, speaking out against small injustices and setting an example for their peers. Richard knew the road ahead would be long, but for the first time, he felt the faint stirrings of progress. It wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't easy, but it was real, and that was enough to keep him moving forward. The following days brought the inevitable resistance Richard had braced himself for. Change, especially in an institution so steeped in its own culture, was never a smooth journey. Whispers in the locker rooms grew louder. Subtle challenges to Richard's authority began to surface, and Daniels, still suspended but lurking in the background, became a rallying figure for those who resented the new chief's approach. One morning, Richard arrived at the precinct to find graffiti scrawled across his office door. You don't belong here. The crude handwriting betrayed the immaturity behind the act. But the message was clear. It wasn't the first sign of dissent, nor would it be the last. Richard stared at the words for a moment before quietly retrieving a cleaning kit from a supply closet. He scrubbed the graffiti off himself, his face calm but resolute. If the message was meant to rattle him, it had failed. That afternoon, Richard called a meeting with the department's senior leadership. The room was tense. The captains and lieutenants clearly aware of the growing unrest but unsure of how to address it. Captain Harris, ever the pragmatist, spoke first. Chief, he began, I think we need to talk about the backlash. There's a lot of tension in the ranks, and it's starting to boil over. Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. What exactly are they resisting? Captain? Accountability? Respect? Harris hesitated. It's not that simple. Some of them feel like they're being painted as villains. They've been here for years, doing things the way they've always been done, and now they're being told it's all wrong. Richard's gaze hardened. Captain, just because something has always been done a certain way doesn't make it right. If that's their justification, it's precisely why change is necessary. The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing on everyone present. Finally, one of the lieutenants, a younger officer named Avery, spoke up. Chief, I think part of the problem is fear, she said, her voice steady but measured. Fear of change, fear of losing their place. Some of these officers are clinging to the old ways because it's all they know. Richard nodded, appreciating her candor. Fear is understandable, Lieutenant, but it's not an excuse for bad behavior. If they're willing to engage, I'll work with them. If they're not, they'll find themselves without a badge. His words landed heavily in the room, but he didn't flinch. This isn't just about them. It's about the community we serve. If we lose sight of that, we've failed. Later that day, Richard walked the precinct again, his eyes scanning for signs of progress or decay. He stopped in the break room, where a group of officers were huddled together. The conversation halted abruptly when he entered. Richard didn't miss the guarded looks exchanged among them. Good afternoon, he said evenly, pouring himself a cup of coffee. The silence stretched, awkward and thick. Finally, one of the younger officers, Jenkins, cleared his throat. Chief, can I ask you something? Richard turned to him, his expression inviting. Of course. Do you really think this department can change? Jenkins asked, his tone a mix of curiosity and doubt. I mean, no offense, but some of these guys, they're set in their ways. Richard took a slow sip of his coffee before responding. Change isn't easy, Jenkins. It's messy and uncomfortable, but it's also possible. The question isn't whether the department can change. The question is whether you and your colleagues are willing to. The room fell silent again, but this time, there was a sense of quiet reflection. Jenkins nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. Not everyone was as contemplative. That evening, Richard received a notice that Daniels had officially filed an appeal against his suspension. citing unfair treatment and bias. The complaint was little more than a thinly veiled attempt to undermine Richard's authority, but it was a complication he couldn't ignore. The following morning, Richard called Captain Harris into his office. "I want a full review of Danielle's record," he said. "Every complaint, every disciplinary action, or lack thereof. We're not just addressing his suspension, we're addressing the culture that allowed him to thrive." Harris nodded. "Understood, Chief. I'll get on it." As the week progressed, the lines between those willing to embrace change and those resisting it became clearer. Officers like Reyes began stepping up, their newfound confidence a beacon of hope amid the chaos. Reyes, in particular, showed remarkable growth, speaking out during a training session about the importance of treating civilians with dignity. Her words were met with a mix of support and skepticism, but she held her ground. "Respect isn't just a word," she said, her voice firm. "It's an action, and if we can't show it to each other, how can we expect the community to trust us?" Richard, observing from the back of the room, felt a flicker of pride. The seeds of change were taking root, even if progress was slow. At the end of the week, Richard sat alone in his office, reflecting on the challenges ahead. The pushback had been stronger than he anticipated, but so too was the potential for transformation. For every Daniels in the precinct, there was a Reyes, ready to rise to the occasion. For every act of defiance, there was a moment of introspection that hinted at something deeper. Richard knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with resistance, but he also knew that every step forward, no matter how small, was worth it. Change was never easy, but it was always necessary, and he wasn't about to back down. The tension in the precinct, while still palpable, began to show cracks of something softer: openness, curiosity, and for a few, the first signs of accountability. Richard made it a point to walk the halls daily, his presence a reminder that he was more than a figurehead behind a desk. It was during these walks that he saw moments of progress, subtle yet significant. One morning, he passed a group of younger officers in the break room discussing a recent community meeting. Officer Reyes, who had grown into a quiet but determined leader, was at the center of the group. Her voice carried conviction as she spoke about how the department needed to listen, not just enforce. "We can't just show up when there's trouble," she said. "People need to see us as part of the community, not separate from it." Richard lingered in the hallway, listening. He didn't interrupt, letting the conversation unfold naturally. Moments like these were proof that the seeds of change were taking root. Small, but they were there. The community outreach events became a cornerstone of Richard's strategy for bridging the gap between the department and the people it served. These events weren't just PR stunts. They were opportunities for genuine connection. Richard attended every one, shaking hands, listening to concerns, and showing the people of Blue Ridge that change was more than a promise. At one event, he noticed a middle-aged woman watching from the edge of the crowd. She clutched her purse tightly, her expression a mix of curiosity and caution. Richard approached her with a warm smile. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said. "I'm Chief Nelson. I noticed you standing here. Is there something on your mind?" She hesitated, then spoke. "I've lived here for 30 years, she said, "and I've never trusted the police. Not after what happened to my son." Her words carried the weight of pain, and Richard felt it deeply. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said. "Would you tell me what happened?" She nodded, her voice faltering as she recounted how her teenage son had been falsely accused of a crime years ago, subjected to harsh treatment, and ultimately exonerated. But not before the damage was done. "They didn't even apologize," she said, her voice breaking. "They just moved on, like it didn't matter." Richard listened without interrupting, his heart heavy. When she finished, he spoke with quiet conviction. "What happened to your son was wrong, and I can't undo it. But I can promise you this. We're working to make sure no one else in this community has to go through what your family did." Her eyes softened, though the pain remained. "We'll see, Chief," she said, her tone guarded but not dismissive. Within the precinct, Richard began implementing new policies designed to foster accountability and mutual respect. Mandatory training sessions on implicit bias and community engagement were met with mixed reactions. Some officers embraced the opportunity to learn, while others grumbled about the changes. Officer Daniels, still suspended but awaiting the results of his internal investigation, remained a divisive figure. His appeal was denied, and the review of his record painted a damning picture. Complaints of excessive force, inappropriate comments, and bullying behavior had been ignored for years. Richard made the findings public within the department, not to humiliate Daniels, but to send a clear message. The era of sweeping misconduct under the rug was over. Not all progress came easily. One afternoon, Richard received a call from a local business owner who had witnessed an officer speaking harshly to a customer outside the store. The officer in question was a senior member of the team, one who had resisted Richard's leadership from the start. When Richard called him into his office, the officer was defensive. "Chief, I was just doing my job." The guy was being difficult. "Doing your job," Richard repeated, his tone measured. "Does your job include speaking to someone in a way that escalates a situation instead of defusing it?" The officer shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't mean any harm." "Intent matters," Richard said, "but so do outcomes. We're here to serve, not intimidate. Consider this a warning. Next time, there will be consequences." The officer left, visibly chastened. It was a small victory, but it reinforced Richard's belief that even the most resistant officers could change, if they were willing to. The turning point came during a department-wide forum where officers were encouraged to share their thoughts and concerns. The room was tense as officers took turns speaking, some expressing frustration with the pace of change, others admitting they had never considered the impact of their actions on the community. When it was Reyes's turn to speak, she stood confidently, her voice steady. "I used to think respect was something you demanded," she said, "but I've realized it's something you earn, by listening, by learning, and by doing better. That's what Chief Nelson has shown me." Her words were met with a mix of nods and thoughtful silence. For the first time, Richard saw a glimmer of unity forming among the officers. That evening, as Richard walked through the precinct, he noticed a subtle but undeniable shift. The laughter was different, softer, more inclusive. Conversations no longer hushed when he passed by. It was far from perfect, but it was progress. In his office, Richard sat at his desk, looking over the notes from the day. The challenges were still immense, but so were the opportunities. Change was slow, messy, and often thankless. But for the first time, Richard felt the weight on his shoulders lighten. He glanced at a small photo on his desk, his wife and daughter. Their smiles a reminder of why he fought so hard for integrity and justice. The road ahead was long, but Richard knew one thing for certain. The precinct, and the community it served, were worth every step. The precinct's transformation was slow but undeniable. Conversations that once died at the sound of Richard's footsteps now continued, laced with a newfound respect. Officers like Reyes, who had once stayed silent in the face of misconduct, now carried themselves with quiet confidence, leading by example. But while progress had been made, resistance lingered in the shadows, clinging to old habits like a stubborn stain. One crisp morning, Richard stepped into the precinct, his routine walk punctuated by nods and brief greetings from officers. He noticed a distinct shift in the atmosphere, not a revolution, but a steady evolution. The air felt lighter, less burdened by the weight of unspoken resentment. Yet, Richard knew better than to rest on his laurels. Real change required constant vigilance. A meeting with Captain Harris later that morning confirmed his suspicions. "Chief," Harris began, sliding a file across Richard's desk, "we've got some officers who aren't adjusting well to the new standards." Richard opened the file, his eyes scanning the names. Some were expected, longtime holdouts resistant to accountability, but a few surprised him. Officers he had hoped might rise to the occasion were still entrenched in old patterns. "These are the ones we need to watch," Harris continued. "They're not outright defiant, but they're not embracing the change either." Richard nodded, his face thoughtful. "We can't drag people forward who don't want to move, but we can make it clear that standing still isn't an option." Later that day, Richard attended a roll call meeting, where he addressed the officers directly. standing at the front of the room. He spoke with the quiet authority that had become his hallmark. "I know this hasn't been easy," he began. "Change never is. But I want to remind you why we're here, not for ourselves, but for the community we serve." His eyes swept the room, meeting the gaze of every officer. Respect, integrity, accountability, these aren't just words. They're the foundation of trust. And without trust, we have nothing. If you can't uphold those values, this isn't the place for you. The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Richard let the silence linger, then added, "But for those of you who are committed to doing better, know this, I will stand with you every step of the way." As the weeks went on, Richard's presence in the precinct became a constant reminder of his commitment to change. He continued to walk the halls, stopping to talk with officers, ask questions, and offer encouragement. He made a point to recognize progress, no matter how small. One afternoon, he found Reyes in the briefing room, reviewing notes from a recent community meeting. She looked up as he entered, a smile breaking across her face. "Chief," she said, "I wanted to share something with you. At the meeting last night, a resident told me she noticed a difference in how we've been interacting with the community. She said she feels like we're actually listening now." Richard's expression softened. "That's good to hear. It's proof that what we're doing is making an impact." Reyes nodded. "It's not just the community, Chief. I see it here too. People are starting to think before they act. It's small, but it's real. It's progress," Richard said. "And progress is what we're here for." Not everyone was as receptive. Daniels, now officially dismissed following the internal investigation, continued to stir trouble from the outside. He filed a formal complaint against the department, alleging discrimination and claiming he was a scapegoat for deeper issues. Richard met the news with calm resolve, knowing that Daniels' actions were the desperate flailing of a man unwilling to accept accountability. The department, however, rallied behind Richard. Officers who had once viewed him with skepticism began to see him as a leader who not only demanded accountability but also supported those willing to change. His willingness to listen, coupled with his firm stance on integrity, earned him respect, even from those who had initially resisted. One evening, Richard attended a town hall meeting, where community members gathered to discuss concerns and provide feedback. A young man in his 20s stood up, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I just wanted to say thank you," the man said. "I've had my share of bad experiences with the police in this town, but lately, it feels like things are starting to change. I see officers talking to people, not just enforcing rules. It gives me hope." Richard listened, his chest tightening with a mix of pride and humility. These moments reminded him why the fight for change was worth it. By the end of his first 6 months as chief, Richard could see the precinct taking on a new identity. Officers who couldn't adapt to the new standards had left, replaced by recruits who shared Richard's vision for a fair and respectful department. Training sessions became opportunities for growth rather than obligations to endure. And the community, once skeptical, began to see the precinct as an ally rather than an adversary. Richard stood in the main hallway one evening, watching as officers filed out after their shifts. The laughter he heard was genuine, no longer tinged with the sharpness of exclusion or mockery. It was the sound of a team beginning to rebuild itself from the inside out. As he locked his office for the night, Richard allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but for the first time, he felt the precinct was moving in the right direction. Change, he realized, wasn't just about policies or punishments. It was about people, those willing to grow, to listen, and to fight for something better. And for Richard, that was a fight worth every step.